So these are some of the activities young people that are involved with in this new culture. They're circulating things, and that turns out to be pretty significant, just to be able to send messages from place to place. They're connecting with people online, and their social communities are emerging. They're creating things. And creativity online often means collaboration, working with other people, including people from different backgrounds, people in different parts of the planet. That's one of the transformative impacts of this new medium. Next slide, please. So here's a story that I think illustrates some of the economic potential of this moment, or some of the cultural potential. At the top we see the final episode of American Idol last season. About 40 million people tuned in to watch the final episode of American Idol last season. One of the most highly rated moments in broadcast history. At the bottom we see Susan Boyle. It's hard to get an adequate count of how many people saw Susan Boyle, but the single most circulated video on YouTube says 79 million people saw that video alone. There's about 20 to 25 different versions of it on YouTube. There are more of that across multiple video sharing platforms. Conservative estimate is that about 200 million people saw Susan Boyle, compared to 40 million people who saw the final episode of American Idol. Now keep in mind, while Susan Boyle's professionally produced content for British television, he was never legally broadcast in the United States, right? So if you saw that video, you saw a pirated copy of that video that traveled across the planet to be part of the conversation that you had wherever you shared it. And most of you in the room probably saw it, most of you probably passed it on to someone else. This became ubiquitous. So we're going to next slide. So some of what happened was that this stuff began to be spread. It got picked up by mainstream news channels. So Jay Leno does a parody of Susan Boyle about 2 or 3 days after it first began to circulate on YouTube. And that amplifies the effect. So broadcasting is still part of the circulation of Susan Boyle. By the way, when I'm talking about Susan Boyle, I'm talking about what I was calling spreadable media, right? And we often talk about this as viral media. That's the word that's going on, or people say, well, it just went viral. And the problem with viral media is the metaphor is one of infection, so that I am an unknowing host who carries messages to my friends and neighbors, and and it spreads germs, essentially. And I don't think that adequately accounts for what happened to Susan Boyle. That millions of people made a conscious decision that something interesting was going on in that video, that they could pass it along to someone else. They chose who they passed it to. They framed it in their conversations with other people. That act of passing along is an active one. And we need to think about the agencies and the negotiations that take place as people pass it along. So we go to the next slide. So we can see Susan Boyle get inserted into a range of different communities and conversations. Here's a blog for science fans who wanted to understand how the vocal cords of Susan Boyle would have worked to produce those sounds in someone with a body like that, right? Okay, next slide. This is a site for karaoke fans who's talking about Susan Boyle is no longer allowed to sing in karaoke bars. And that's a specific sort of framing of the Susan Boyle story. All right, next slide. This is a church blog where church people pray a prayer circle for Susan Boyle because she was very devout in her religious faith. Next slide. This is a site for moms, and because she's very involved as a major caregiver for her mother, and the relationship she has to her mother gets discussed on this particular blog. Next slide, please. And this is a fashion blog, which is dissecting the makeover of Susan Boyle for the second episode of the show. So the point of this is all of these different communities had different conversations which shaped the circulation of the Susan Boyle material. It wasn't one size fits all, lowest common denominator. This was a resource communities used to communicate with each other. So the most basic level, this digital culture invites us to continually make choices and make meanings of the materials of the culture around us in a much more active way than you did in an age of broadcast when you chose between the 3 networks and what passed over your television set. So go to the next slide. Now what's interesting is, in the midst of all of this, while the public quickly found content and circulated at a massive scale, the industry was incapable of responding to that. So Fremantle Media, which produces Britain's Got Talent, only had made it for the British television, couldn't negotiate deals with American television networks to get the show on the air while Susan Boyle was still competing, couldn't negotiate a deal with iTunes to get the stuff distributed through iTunes. It was only of it, but you went to this site, which is a pirate site where you get illegal downloads of TV shows, you could watch it, right? So we're seeing that piracy is often quicker in responding to the market demands created by this rapid circulation and mapping of value in this new culture than industry has been. And this is, I think, long-term, has huge implications for the world that we're going to live in, especially those of you in the media industry. So if we go to the next slide. And this process is continuing. This is the winner of Ukraine's Got Talent. And if you look, 7 million views now on YouTube and growing. It's grown about 5 million in the last month as this stuff begins to be circulated. Now, odds are most Americans never thought, oh, there must be cool content on Ukrainian television, right? And if you see the comments here, most of them are in English, which suggests that, in fact, it jumped language barriers, it jumped national barriers. People were seeking out content that was interesting to them and circulating. This is a really compelling video if you haven't seen it. But it's an example of the coattail of the Susan Boyle phenomenon, that we now are in a position where media is going to flow into our lives from all sides of the planet, but the choices are not made at a corporate level by some gatekeeper. They're made at a grassroots level by millions of people choosing to pass it along to someone else through a variety of social networks. So I think that's the heart of what we're looking at in the Spreadable Media project. So if we go to the next slide, then. Something similar is taking place in Iran, right? The streets of Iran, protesters were sending messages through Twitter to the world. Now, initially, the story of Iran, people said it's a Twitter revolution. Well, the revolution wasn't organized on Twitter. A relatively small percentage of Iranians have access to Twitter. The keyboard doesn't accommodate the Farsi alphabet. It was mostly those tweets are mostly targeted to the outside world. They tap the very powerful Iranian communities in America, in Europe, of exiles and immigrants, and through that channel reach Western eyes. And it was an attempt to shape public opinion in the West and keep attention on their government at a time that they expected repressive response to the protest. We go to the next slide. But what it did also was raise expectations for media institutions. So the hashtag CNN failed was people putting pressure on CNN, having discovered this grassroots stuff and realizing that a lot of it might be false or not accurate or rumors. They wanted responsible professional journalists to step in and cover it more. And so Twitter put pressure on CNN to up its coverage of what was taking place in Iran. And so we're seeing, again, an intersection of commercial and grassroots media shaping the communication environment we're living in right now. Next slide, please. So, continuing down the path, this is sort of the stuff I talked about at 5D, was this idea of transmedia storytelling. So if we live in a world where every idea flows across every available media channel, then we have to acquire new skills to process the circulation of information. So transmedia storytelling is a mode of entertainment where bits of information about a world are distributed across many, many platforms. This is an org chart for the Zion Resistance Underground Army from the Matrix franchise. Right? And what's interesting is you could not watch any given text of the Matrix and get this information. This is information distributed across 3 movies, about 12 animated short subjects, about 25 comic book storylines, 3 video games, and the internet community put it together collectively by taking pieces of information that was dispersed across all of those channels. And it's an example of what we call collective intelligence. It points to the complexity of pop culture in the world that we're doing to, and networks are demanding that complexity. A network society wants problems big enough for a network to confront, and our entertainment becomes more complex accordingly. Next slide. So this is the social relationships on X-Men. Just say comments I've never quite understood, and I now understand why, having this chart, right? But this is not dumbing down, right, to think about how popular culture actually works. These are all characters who have complex relationships to each other. But of course, that's an adolescent media. But if we go to the next slide, here's Pokemon. This is a sort of table of the different characters in Pokemon. Each of those characters have multiple states of being, multiple antagonisms and friendships. It's a system altogether more complex than the periodic table. And yet we don't say, poor little Johnny, he's behind because I understand Pokemon. Right? The expectation is that no kid will know all of Pokemon, but every kid learns the parts of it that matter to them. And when they get together on a playground, they trade notes, they exchange information with each other. And it's designed to be more complex than can be grasped by a single mind. Now compare that to schools, which often say we can't possibly learn the pantheon of Greek gods, it's too complex a system for our kids, right? So who's dumbing down our culture right now? Is it popular culture, or is it the way we frame our education around very narrow expectations of what students can perform?